Professor Watson, you may begin.
I'm not seeing anyone,
There are 16 people in the room at the moment.
Okay, so I'm going ahead, Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on China-Caribbean trade, trends and implications for regional growth. I am Patrick Watson. I shall be chairing today's session, and we are going to be dealing with this in a very lively manner. Let's hope that that is the case. And we are going to, first of all, ask our speakers to address us, and then we will ask the questions. And it's only when the speakers have completed, we will begin asking the questions, which you are going to be invited. You're going to ask to write in, to enter your questions as in notes. And I, the moderator, with my assistant, will be asking the panelists to respond accordingly. We are going to be focusing today on the trade and development impact of China on the Caribbean as a whole. And just to remind you that the discussion is being hosted by the Trade and Economic Development Unit of the University of the West Indies, TADU, as it's called. And it's part of a national conversation platform as a forum to facilitate engagement between experts on the Caribbean economy and the rest of the populations of the Caribbean. We want to ensure out of TADU that these conversations help us and that keep the public informed of critical information and analysis of the economy in a timely fashion. Of course, dealing with China is a big issue. China is not just an economic powerhouse. China is a military powerhouse. China is challenging the United States of America for the #1 spot in the world, economically, militarily, and otherwise, and has an influence all around the globe. And we are going to be very concerned in this session on the historical trade and development linkages between China and the CARICOM region. And I would say we will spill over to the wider Caribbean as well. I'm sure that is going to happen. We are going to be, our main speaker today is Dr. Mark Wenner, who is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Virgin Islands, who will reflect on China's increased visibility in the Caribbean through various projects and initiatives. He will be followed by our own Professor Roger Hossain, who will address the changing trade relations with China, and then Dr. Boendradat Tiwari, who will reflect on some of the associated policy implications for development. I am going to now introduce Dr. Wenner, who is going to speak to you on this. I've already indicated what he is, and I'll repeat that. He is currently serving as assistant professor of economics at the University of the Virgin Islands. Prior to that, he served as the chief economist for the Division of Economic Research for the government of the Virgin Islands and as an economist for the Inter-American Development Bank. I hope Dr. Wenner is ready, and I now ask that he come forward and begin his presentation. Dr. Wenner, the floor is all yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Watson, for the kind words of introduction. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Wenner, and it's a distinct honor and pleasure to be here with you to share some brief remarks. So let me first share my screen and let's get started. Okay, so in the allotted time that I have, what I will do more than anything is to try to set the stage so we can have a more in-depth discussion by some of my fellow panelist members to start to dig deeper in some of the points I will raise, and then hopefully we have a lively discussion, a lively exchange. So I will basically try to track the rising presence of China in the Caribbean region in terms of trade flows, in foreign direct investments, and in the amount of development finance that has been granted to the region. In my presentation, I will attempt to cover 4 brief points. First, I will begin with the history of the People's Republic engagement in the region, then look at the stated strategic objectives of Chinese foreign economic policy as regards the region, and then look at the statistical evidence. What do we see in terms of trade flows? What do we see in terms of outward foreign direct investments of China into various Caribbean countries? And what do we see in terms of the amount and the number of development finance loans that have been granted to Caribbean states? If time permits, we may look at some of the signature Chinese projects in the region. And then lastly, I will end with this basically passing the ball to my colleagues and being a point guard and trying to set them up for an assist. I will generally, and in a very perfunctory way, look at, what has there been benefits accrued? What are the risks? And then hopefully the other panelists would go into greater detail and for discussions. So basically the history. We must recognize that China for a very long period was a very closed and inward-looking society. And this was during the era of Mao Zedong, the first leader of China. And this period lasted from roughly 1949 to 1976. During the time of the first wave of Caribbean decolonization, China did not really recognize any of the newly Caribbean states. The first Caribbean state that China recognized was Cuba in 1961, which was a fellow socialist communist state. And it was only a decade later that China began to successively recognize the newly independent Caribbean island states. So in 1972, it began with Guyana and Jamaica, 1974, Trinidad and Tobago, 1976, Suriname, and Barbados in 1977. And then there was a second later wave of decolonization of the smaller Eastern Caribbean states that happened in the 1980s. During this early period, Chinese policy was sort of incoherent, and it was basically centered on a game of one-upmanship. And so it's been colloquially called the era of checkbook diplomacy. Because of the rivalry between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, or Taiwan, China views Taiwan as a runaway province and is seeking reunification. And Taiwan seeks to assert itself as an independent, democratic, constitutional rule of law state. And so because of this political difference, the two countries played a game of showering various developing countries with economic assistance on the condition that you recognize them. So in the Caribbean, this rivalry played out as it did in other places in the world. And just to give you one example, St. Lucia played this game to the hilt of trying to maximize the amount of economic assistance to get from one or the other. So in 1984, St. Lucia recognized the Republic of China. Then it recognized the People's Republic of China. And then it reverted back in 2007 to the Republic of China or Taiwan. And it currently recognizes Taiwan and not the Red China. Overall, the PRC has prevailed over the stretch of time. And so currently of the 13 independent Caribbean states, only 5 recognize Taiwan: Haiti, St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, Belize, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now, looking at the sea change in terms of foreign policy of China, it really begins in 1982. And this was in part outgrowth of all of the domestic liberalization that was going on. And under Deng Xiaoping, China opened up to the world. And so basically China had a marked increase of exports, manufacturers to virtually every corner of the world. They increased their foreign direct investments abroad. And during this period it was a period of rapid industrialization for China, and they were experiencing, very high single-digit growths, double-digit growths going up, I think to the highest was 14 or 15%. This rapid industrialization that drove a super commodity cycle that lasted roughly from 2002 to 2013, 2014. And during this period, the prices for commodities shot up. And so in the Caribbean, the countries that are natural resource rich and commodity exporters, they benefited tremendously. So in the case of Cuba, it was nickel and zinc. In the case of Jamaica, bauxite, Trinidad and Tobago oil and gas, and Guyana and Suriname, the same profile, basically minerals and timber. Now, we have a change of leadership in China, and now we're in the current, phase of Chinese relations with the rest of the world and indirectly with the Latin America and the Caribbean region. So the current president, Xi Jinping, in 2013, announced the Belt Road Initiative. And this is $1 trillion program that's aimed at financing infrastructure projects, that's aimed in financing infrastructure projects in transportation, energy, extractive industry. And the whole aim of this is basically threefold. One is to secure and help countries that are natural resource rich more easily transport and engage in sales of their natural resources and energy to China. And on the flip side, as they will then become new markets that Chinese firms can penetrate for exports of goods and services. And then the third reason linked to the infrastructure development one is that the infrastructure projects would be financed by the development finance institution, China Import-Export Bank, and they would use transnationals, construction transnationals, and they would use Chinese labor. So by building all of these big infrastructure projects abroad, it's a win for China in the sense that they can absorb and export a lot of their surplus labor to work in these overseas projects. And then lastly, it was to basically develop the capabilities and the reputation of Chinese transnationals and state-owned enterprises overseas. So in the early 2010s, I believe it was 2012, Chinese leaders visited the region and they promised big bucks. And they were very well received. And this Chinese munificent was welcomed by Caribbean leaders because they were capital constrained. And the dominant economic partner that they had, the United States, had largely been neglectful. The US, in their limited amount of development assistance to the region, was focusing much more on drug interdiction and not big, large-scale infrastructure development projects, transformative projects. And the US always tends to ignore Latin America and the Caribbean because crises in the Middle East and Russia and the global war on terror always seems to take first priority. So currently, 10 Caribbean countries are participating in the Belt Road Initiative: Cuba, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, Barbados, Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname. So basically, now turning to the kind of the statistical evidence, what do we see what do we see of this engagement? So I will basically hit on four main areas. So what we basically see in terms of development finance is that we see that over the period of 2005 to 2022, the Caribbean region has received approximately $5.7 billion. And you can see that it goes up and down. And, 2019 was a very good year. And so but this amount, to kind of put it to frame it and to normalize it, it's a very, very tiny amount compared to, say, the entirety of Latin America. So it's 4% of the total amount that went to Latin America. Latin America got $130.3 billion. So now looking at by country, you see that basically the most favored country to date has been Jamaica. They've had some 11 different loan operations, and they have been able to garner roughly $2.1 billion in development finance. And the least and the most recent is the Dominican Republic. Okay. Now, looking at the outward FDI flows, is the top line in this graph, the kind of blue-gray line, represents the total amount of FDI, outward FDI of China over time since roughly 2004, when good statistics started to be captured. And it's just been a phenomenal increase. And so now, they've basically gone from 5 billion to 158 billion. But if we look at the Caribbean, we can see that the Caribbean is really small potatoes compared to other regions of the world. So China is most interested in its neighborhood, which is basically Southeast Asia. And you can see Asia is by far the largest recipient of Chinese FDI, and it makes sense. In terms of the Caribbean, if we include the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman, the numbers look astronomically good. But for the sake of more objectivity, we really need to remove those two countries because it's sort of artificial. The British Virgin Islands and the Caymans are offshore banking centers. And basically, the Chinese prefer to set up special purpose vehicles, SVPs, in order to establish joint ventures and in order to transfer the funds to other countries. And so basically, we need to, this FDI that you see recorded for Bahamas and for BVI and Caymans is not staying in those two countries. So if we extract those numbers, because it's really just a pass-through, and we look at the Caribbean region, it looks quite modest compared to the other regions. So for the last the last year that I have is 82 million. Now, trade flows. I will not go into great detail because I know Dr. Hussein will delve into this. But the big points, three big points I'd like to make here. One is that the increase in the flows has been phenomenal. We've gone roughly from $1 billion in 2002 to 8 billion in 2019. But the benefits the trade balance has been largely in favor of China. So of this amount of flows between China and this region, 6.1 billion of it is Chinese exports, and only 1.9 billion is imports from the Caribbean region into China, or you can say conversely, exports of the Caribbean region. Second point, the Caribbean exports are resource-based, they're commodity-based. So the primary exports is alumina, nickel, forest metal, oil, gas, timber. There's very, very few Caribbean service exports. And so I leave it at that. So on this area, the benefits that have accrued for the Caribbean states is basically being able to afford maybe cheaper merchandises and a wider variety of merchandise, say, as compared to if they had to import the same manufacturers from another country. In terms of the big countries that I think we should focus our attention on, when you combine the FDI and the DF, the development finance, these are the six big recipients of Chinese.
Dr. Wenner, I think you should be getting to the end of your presentation. Now you had 15 minutes. You have gone over. I have let you go.
Okay.
But I think I'll give you 3 more minutes, okay?
Okay, thank you, sir. And so so those are the big ones. Now, the last question, the last area I want to touch on, and this is basically the segue and summary slide and the segue into hopefully a richer discussion. So can we say that the Caribbean has benefited from the Chinese economic presence? On trade, we can probably say no, is that there's really very little presence of value-added products and services in the exports going to from the region going to China. So our sophistication content is low, value-added content is low. On infrastructure developments, we can say, in the broadest sense, yes, the roads, the container ports, the bridges, the hotels, the stadiums, the public buildings, the low-income housing constructed by the Chinese probably would not have been completed by other means. And so if you look at the traditional sources of finance for the Caribbean coming from, say, the US has gone backwards over the last 2 decades in terms of the amounts of its foreign assistance and its FDI. And also the Caribbean states tend to be debt constrained, so they cannot easily access capital markets to borrow for these big major investment that they need. However, there's lots of problems with environmental sustainability, social equity, transparency, and governance, and we need a lot more micro-level assessment of these various projects. There's lots of anecdotal evidence and a couple journalistic reports that suggest a less than satisfactory condition in some cases. In terms of productivity gains, which from a point of view of economics, I think is the most important one we should look at, we can't say anything. The data is a problem, and the few countries where there's some total factor productivity constant dollar studies done, the only one that has improved over time is Trinidad and Tobago. So it does not seem that this Chinese-built infrastructure to date has had much of a transformative bang in increasing productivity, because the theory would suggest if you have more modern, adequate infrastructure, then that would facilitate lower marketing costs, facilitate higher productivity, higher economic growth. And we don't see those in the macro numbers. The other big question is debt sustainability, and this is my last point. The Western countries, namely United States, has accused China of using the Belt Road Initiative as debt diplomacy. That basically the shower countries with concessional aid, turnkey infrastructure development projects get over indebted, and when they get over indebted, they then extract concessions from the country. And the poster child is the case of Sri Lanka, which built a very large port with very few feasibility studies, no environmental studies, very lax standards of underwriting. And long story short, the port did not work, and the Chinese seized, the Sri Lankans couldn't service the debt, and the Chinese seized the port under a 99-year lease. And so if we look now at debt in the Caribbean, and if I did a very simple analysis looking at covariation of coefficient of variation for the debt to GDP series for the main countries that are participating in the Belt Road Initiative, 2005, 2006, you don't see any high indebtedness that you can easily attribute to the Chinese presence in the region. Most of the countries that had problems at the beginning of the period with high debt, Barbados and Jamaica, and they're the same ones that are slowly reducing their debt load towards the end of the period. And what seems to be more driving the rise in the debt of Caribbean states, especially the smaller states, say as Dominica, is the residual external shocks that's forcing up the indebtedness. And so this is the last slide I close with. So you can see basically the big jump up in peaks in debt coincide with external shocks, the 2007, 2009 great financial recession, and then the 2019 to 2020, the global pandemic. And if you look at the countries that are over 100% debt to GDP ratio, we have Barbados, we have Suriname, and the one that has, and we see some reduction in the case of Dominica and in the case of Jamaica. So with that, I end. And I will say thank you for your attention and your indulgence for allowing me to go a little long. So
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wenner. I will go immediately to Professor Roger Hossain, who is a professor of economics at the University of the West Indies, and he is the principal coordinator of the Trade and Development Economic Unit, who is hosting this session. He specializes in international trade, but his research in recent times has centered around wider areas of economics, including budgeting and fiscal responsibility. So Roger, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes, and I will stick to it this time.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Watson. Thank you, everyone. Just to say that myself, Dr. Boinjana Tiwari, who is another panelist here, and Dr. Rebecca Gookool, who is one of the hosts, we are in the process of brainstorming and pulling together our material on a book on the economic impact of China on the Caribbean. We have a substantive understanding of the data and the associated statistical and econometric material, and we will definitely present some of the findings later on in the year with you all as we go along. Well, that was an excellent presentation by Mark. It was good detail. In fact, I will definitely invite him to do a guest lecture later on to my graduate Caribbean Economic Development class on this topic. Quickly, I just showed some simple comparative data here between China and India, and shows the population of China as compared to India, the GDP and exports and so on. As you can see, China is a phenomenally big player in terms of world GDP and in terms of world export share. Here you can see the rapid growth of China over time in terms of China as a percent of world GDP. You can see how that has increased, and you can see the Chinese GDP there itself in blue and how that has progressed. This shows the per capita GDP of China, nothing short of phenomenal. And the destination of FDI in 2019, you could see that China was a really big recipient. Now, what captured my attention as I do research is the changing structure of the Chinese economy. And as you can see here, the services sector of the Chinese economy has started to grow considerably, and the services sector is a great user of factor inputs from around the world, so that China's import demand would continue, given the rise in the service sector and the fairly buoyant manufacturing sector to still have a heavy import presence. Here we see the merchandise exports of the Chinese economy, and you can see the phenomenal growth. That's really phenomenal growth there as compared to the other countries. China is now the big player in the global economy as compared in terms of merchandise export trade. When you compare China to a country like, say, the UK in 1960 and 2022, it's a phenomenal rise in terms of capability. And here are some other numbers. China's exports as a percent of GDP continues to be fairly high, and its merchandise exports continue to be fairly high as well. This shows that China is not only exporting to high-income economies, but over time, it has become a very dominant exporter to low and middle income economies throughout the global economy. Now, here, if you look at school enrollment, you could see it's using World Development Indicators, it's high. There are statistical explanation for the enrollment levels being above 100 at some point. You can see secondary school enrollment is also very high, and tertiary enrollment is on the rise. The factor endowment base of the Chinese economy is changing, and if that is changing, that means their productive capability would also change. Here you see the percentage of manufacturing exports from China rising considerably to the global economy, and no doubt that's why we see so much manufactured goods from China in the Caribbean with the passing of time. Here we see the import performance of China. So it's not a mercantilist economy. It's also heavily involved in imports. And here we see the amount of merchandise imports from the Latin American region, relatively small as compared to other parts of the world. So there is still tremendous scope for Latin America and the Caribbean to engage China in a greater amount of economic activity via trade. Now, it is well known that China's fuel imports has increased considerably with time, and that has helped. I know Mark mentioned the commodity super cycles. In terms of the energy commodity price super cycle, China has played a very important role in over the period 1999 to 2022, influencing the price of fuel and ores and metals. Now, one of the areas that I think Caribbean people would have to pay much more attention to is outbound travelers from China. It's growing significantly in numbers, and this may be the right time to target the Chinese market and to a lesser extent the Indian market, because those are markets that are high and growing. And if we move early enough, we could probably get niche opportunities with those big economies. This shows the share of exports of CARICOM countries to China. And as Mark mentioned, no tremendous dent there, Mark. But again, because of the massive size of the Chinese economies, there is significant room for growth. And this shows some of the other data in terms of absolute numbers. You can see, again, not outstanding performance, and there is room for considerable growth that I can elaborate on in the question and answers period. I tried to show some of the top 25 commodities using SITC 3-digit data that are exported to China over time. Now here I show the number of zeros. Now basically, by the number of zeros, that means the number of sections that you don't export. So the maximum amount of HS 6-digit export sections are 5,300. So China doesn't export in 2022 in 332. So in other words, they export in the majority of areas. Whereas, as you can see, the Caribbean countries, because of their thin resource endowment, only export in very few areas. And this shows here the number of zero exports from China to CARICOM. And as you can see, it has significantly decreased over time. And this shows here the number of zeros to China from CARICOM. And you can see as it's very large. We don't export, Mark, a significant number of the possible HS 6-digit areas to China. And here we show the main export market of the Chinese. And as you can see, the CARICOM is accounting for 0.12% or thereabouts, a very tiny part. So there is room for trade there if we could pursue the right opportunities, if we could calculate export potentials, if we could work on missed opportunities, actually work out what China is buying more of, and we have productive comparative advantage capability in, and therefore find easy, low-hanging fruit opportunities. I have 3 more minutes, so what I would do, I would go straight to the conclusion, where I think I should spend 2 minutes. So the big opportunity from the Chinese.
Roger, I will allow the timer, but you have really only 1 more minute, but
Okay,
go ahead.
all right. Yeah.
But don't go beyond that time, okay?
No problem. The concluding thoughts are, I think given the tendencies in the global economy, we need to pay much more attention to China, but in a technical way, in a way it shows that we understand the missed opportunities, we understand the export potential, we understand where the trade dynamic gives the greatest return, and rather than having things only like trade visits and seminar visits, we do the actual technical work at CARICOM, we do the actual technical work at our Ministry of Trade, so that when we engage China, we know exactly where the lowest hanging fruits are in terms of trade, in terms of export diversification. Mark mentioned the opportunity for the Belt and Road Initiative. Although, as he also mentioned, we have to be careful about the potential getting trapped in the case of debt. I looked at the Malaysia and the Sri Lanka case in detail, and that was largely on account, in my understanding, of the facts of political errors in Sri Lanka and in Malaysia, and not necessarily because China tried to trap these countries. So that's something that could be debated. And so in closing, I would say here lies a monster economy, a giant economy, a big economy that's going to become the largest economy in the world in the near future. And I think it makes very, very good sense for us to embrace them and engage them in a deeper way, not neglecting our other traditional trading ties, but in a manner and form that leads to overall inclusive development. So I stop there, and I would add whatever else I could via the answer and question phase. Thank you. Dr. Watson, Professor Watson? Are you all hearing me?
Yes, sorry, I didn't unmute.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Roger. And I go straight away to Bo, who is going to be bringing the curtain down on the speakers, but not on the show, because we are sure to have a lot of interesting questions. Dr. Tiwari served as Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies. He also served as Executive Director of the UE Institute of Business for 9 years before he was appointed Principal. He also served, and this is the part I want to stress, for 9 years he was a member of Parliament, both in the upper and the lower house, and was a minister, I think, for all the time that you were a member of Parliament, both in the upper and the and the lower house. Sorry, I was just asked to show my handsome face. I forgot to do that. So, but I'm sure you're much more interested in seeing Dr. Tiwari's face at this point in time. So I'm going to give him the 10 minutes, but I'm going to allow the latitude I allow to Roger and to Dr. Werner as well, but not too much, Bo. So
Right.
go ahead, Bo.
Yeah, I'll try to be pointed. Thank you so much, Professor Watson. I'm happy to be part of this Trade and Development Unit seminar and to make a small contribution. I will structure my presentation, if I can get through all of it, in 3 parts. Key recent steps in strengthening the relationship between the Caribbean and China. 2, what is happening now in selected Caribbean countries. And 3, the issues of size and the critical importance of geopolitical developments. And I'm going to ask the question, how much does the Caribbean matter to China? Now, in 2008, China prepared a policy paper. It was published by the State Council of the Government of China, outlining China's interest in Latin America and the Caribbean. That was the beginning, you might say, of a very focused interest by China in our part of the world. Today, China is a major presence in the Caribbean and Latin America in trade, investment, and development. And this relationship has been growing and intensifying. If the 2008 Chinese perspective on Latin America and the Caribbean was important, the 2013 visit to Trinidad and Tobago, when Kamala Persad-Bissessar was Prime Minister, by Xi Jinping, the current president of China, was also vitally important. The Chinese president at that time took the time to meet with every leader of CARICOM that was not aligned to Taiwan, and each engagement was reported on in the Chinese government website through the Chinese Foreign Embassy, and issues about which they spoke were actually outlined. So that visit to Trinidad and Tobago personalized relations with Trinidad and Tobago, but also facilitated one-to-one engagements with other Caribbean leaders and began to deepen the kind of relationship that was possible with China. And it established a platform for bilateral engagement by CARICOM countries. In CARICOM, the following countries recognize Taiwan. I won't say that because Mark mentioned. So those countries were not engaged by the president of China. But the visit to TT was also a hemispheric visit, because from here, the Chinese president went to Costa Rica, he flew to Mexico, and he then went to the United States. So the Caribbean visit, you might say, to Trinidad and Tobago was a kind of initiation for Xi Jinping to this part of the world, but also to give him a sense of the countries that China considered important in the hemisphere. This notwithstanding, CARICOM trade with China was $8 billion in 2019. China export to this part of the world was about $6 billion though, and imports from CARICOM only $2 million US. When Xi Jinping visited in 2013, trade with China was only $450 million US. So in the intervening years, there has been some significant growth, although not well balanced in our favor, more in China's favor. Today, China's investment in CARICOM countries is over $10 billion US. Trinidad and Tobago signed an agreement in 2013 for cooperation in energy, minerals, and infrastructure development, and to advance new cooperation in new energy, telecommunications, and agriculture. Trinidad and Tobago also got a soft loan of $250 million for the Children's Hospital, and relations with China deepened under the current Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, and his government. And one good result has been the establishment of the Phoenix Park Economic Zone project. The Chinese president also opened up the Belt and Road Initiative to the Caribbean, actually in 2013. The Trinidad and Tobago government was the first to join that initiative, and Phoenix Park investment was a follow-through on that sign-on. Currently, there are 10 countries, and I won't mention the countries because Mark mentioned them, have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative from the Caribbean. And that Belt and Road Initiatives includes over 160 countries now. This is what one academic at the Institute of International Relations had to say about the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm quoting here from Anita Montoot, who is the acting director of the Institute of International Relations at UWI, St. Augustine. She says, the initiative provides the commensurate infrastructure, that's the Belt and Road, to support and facilitate the unimpeded movement of goods, services, and capital, allowing for the trans-border flow of personnel and technology. She was very high in praise for Belt and Road as an initiative that will support, quote, consistent, high-quality foreign direct and domestic investment as a key to sustain growth. The actual facility in Phoenix Park involves 580,000 square meters of land. It is near to a port, Flip Deco, and is equipped with modern infrastructure. This is what Montut said to a Chinese news agency about the park. The park offers opportunities for Trinidad and Tobago to expand and diversify its manufacturing base towards non-traditional manufacturing, as it will house between 60 to 80 factory shelves, directly employ 4,500 persons, and contribute about $1.6 billion annually to GDP. In closing, Montut said that, quote, Caribbean countries share similar challenges that BRI projects could help overcome or alleviate, and that the Belt and Road Initiative does not have a set of broad ideological conditions which countries must adhere to in order to participate. Technically, that means that the model allows countries to develop projects with China that are specific to their needs. Now, from my point of view, only time will tell if these things are true and likely to fan out in reality. But there can be no question that China's interest in the region, in trade, investment, finance, projects, has increased in every Caribbean country from Cuba, Jamaica, and the Bahamas in the north, to Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana and Suriname in the south, and every country in between. China's presence, power, influence, and economic engagement in the region has been growing. The region's advancement in trade and services towards China, on the other hand, has been very limited and muted. Trade has grown, but the balance is in favor of China exports. Loans have grown, which presents its own set of problems of repayment, or worst case scenario, as has happened in some countries, surrender of assets. Some issues worthy of note, though, in terms of the continuing development of relations with China and the Caribbean, are the following. China has surpassed the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and the IMF combined as Latin America's top lender for energy and infrastructure projects. That means that it is a larger lender than the 22 Paris Club governments all together. Now, I know Mark said that there was a small financing component when you compare the Caribbean to the rest of the world. But when you look at the Latin American region, and the Caribbean is not seen from China's point of view as different from that, maybe distinct, but not different, I think it is important to watch what is happening. China is also the largest export market for Brazil, Chile, Peru, Cuba, and Uruguay at the current time. Imports from Latin America by the United States have fallen by 40% in the last 15 years. China is both a member of the IDB
Both 3 more
and
minutes,
the CDB.
3 minutes.
Okay, with significant shareholderships and influence in both banks. There is no question that China has been positioning itself to play a bigger, more influential and strategic role, not only in the region, but in the hemisphere, with both Caribbean as well as Latin America. China owns the 4 largest banks in the world according to asset size. I won't mention them. And they also have 2 specialized banks, China Development Bank and Export-Import Bank, specifically for the financing in developing countries such as ourselves and Latin America. Who do these banks lend to? They lend to governments, intergovernmental bodies. So technically, if all the countries of CARICOM were aligned to China diplomatically, they could lend to CARICOM as an institution, and they lend to majority state-owned entities. So technically, these two banks could lend to WASA, TNT, etc. And the security for lending is by sovereign guarantees. So there is no question in my mind that the various initiatives have led to a deepening relationships between China and the Caribbean. And I just want to mention a couple of things in terms of investment. In Guyana, the China National Corporation for Exploration and Development owns 30% of a consortium developing, exploring for oil in Guyana, which is anticipated to yield 10 billion barrels equivalent. There are other investment there from everything from hydropower and electricity to roads, but I won't go into that. In Antigua and Barbuda, it has $1 billion invested, and they're working with them on oceanography, green economy, and tourism. In the Bahamas, they bought a hotel and they expanded the hotel. They are building a port 50 miles from the United States coast on Grand Bahama, and they control the other container port in the Bahamas. In Jamaica, Mark talked about that. They have invested about $3 billion. They have bought over the aluminum refinery. They own the Kingston port. They have invested $1 billion in road construction, and all the roadside along the main road has been given to the government of China. In Grenada, they've built a stadium. In Barbados, they built other things, Suriname, timber, and the dominant ownership of the
we should be wrapping up,
retail sector. In Cuba, a very deep relationship, and in DR as well, they exchange diplomatic status for investment of about $5.6 billion in that particular country. I will close by saying that the big issue is, given this involvement in the Caribbean, which involves, I want to say, not just land space, but the entire ocean space. You know, China is a big country. All of the Caribbean is about 44 million square kilometers. CARICOM itself is about 19 square kilometers. And we are talking there not only about the islands or the countries, we are talking about the water space. So as a growing maritime power, and as a power that has built 40 ports in Latin America and the Caribbean alone, out of some 100 ports that they have built all over the world. And China itself has about 2,000 small ports in addition to its major ports. And clearly maritime power is one of the things that it seeks. It is a big builder. I think that we need to look at the geopolitics more than anything else in terms of what will determine Chinese sensitivity in its engagement of the hemisphere and the Caribbean with it. It will demand a tremendous navigation skill on the part of Caribbean governments to be able to do that, because we have arrangements now with the EU, US, and Canada that are special trade and economic arrangements that are very beneficial from our point of view. And we need also to look at the development of the debt profile and what that implies in our relationship with China. So the geopolitics, the debt, and the balancing of the trade, specialized trade agreements we now have with what China might offer through the Belt and Road are things that we have to think about and worry about. And Mr. Chairman, my apologies for going over the time.
Okay, thank you very much, Bo. It was very interesting. That's why I let you continue. I was generous with all the speakers, and I hope that they are going to be generous with us in their responses now. I'm going to actually start where Bo ended, but I will address it first to Dr. Wenna, and then Bo could probably take up from there. There's a specific question about the geopolitical tension between China and Taiwan. And we mentioned, two speakers mentioned the countries in the Caribbean that have recognized Taiwan. And how will that geopolitical tension between China and Taiwan impact the region from a trade and development perspective? So Dr. Wenna, you want to respond? And then if Bo wishes, he could take it up from there. Then I'll ask a question to Professor Holstein. Go ahead, Mark.
Yes, well, very good question. I'm trying to gather my thoughts. I think basically, the tension in the Indo-Pacific region is rising, and the main military flashpoint is obviously whether or not China and under this new presidency of Jinping, whether he will continue to be even more aggressive in seeking reunification with China. So there are a couple options that are on the table, and each of them would have trade implications. So because I think eventually what will be triggered is that the United States will be seeking a coalition against China, and Taiwan itself also will be seeking external support. And so then you kind of have to pick sides, and that will affect, trade relations and investment. So the scenarios for the conflict in the Indo-Pacific centering around the Taiwan. One is that China will not invade Taiwan, but basically just try to keep it isolated and under pressure. A second scenario would be a sort of a naval blockade and forcing China to basically internally try to put forward political candidates that would favor reunification with China under some guise of having some sort of autonomy, that they will remain, quote, in commas, democratic. And it'll be maybe 50 years of promising to allow them to be democratic, as they did with, say, Hong Kong in 1997 when the British left Hong Kong. They worked out some promises from Red China as to how to treat the people of Hong Kong, and we see steadily now erosions of the democracy in Hong Kong. And the third one, and the worst scenario, would be an open armed conflict between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China over Taiwan, that basically the U.S. will intervene on the side of Taiwan, and you have a hot war. So my probably most likely, or I think the most likely outcome is that it'll just be continued pressure on Taiwan, isolating Taiwan. And so the trade implications for that are twofold. One is that Taiwan now is basically only has 17 countries in the world that recognize it. And most of them are very small places like the Vatican, Monaco, and some small islands in Oceania and in the Caribbean. So basically, Taiwan is on the ropes, and the only support they have is the US. But in the big thing of Taiwan that can affect the entire world is Taiwan is the home of the best silicone semiconductor industry by far. They make the most sophisticated chips, and that could have a ripple effect if that industry is disrupted, because it powers everything. I guess, cars, everything, the chips that they produce, this revolution that's going on in AI, in quantum computing, that's coming, it's all being powered, and chips that Taiwan are innovating and producing. And so I think that would have massive ripple effects across the globe in that. In terms of specifically with the Caribbean, if you had a hot war between the U.S. and China, the U.S. would put a lot of pressure on the Caribbean states to stop trade with China. So that's how I see it, the geopolitics affecting it.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. I wonder if Bo wants to add something to that, or shall I move on to Roger with my question for Roger?
No, very quickly, I think that the Taiwan issue is a hot and bubbling issue, and it's going to become more intense. I do agree with Mark that that the U.S. will try to create alliances that would make it very, very difficult for China to do anything that is over disruptive of the current situation. But China has its own problems in the China Sea. I mean, she has problems with the Philippines. She has problems with every little island in South Sea China. There is dispute over ownership with other countries. And I think that what is going to happen is that you are going to have an intensification thrust for containment of China within her own domain and on her own seas, while China herself is going to try to become so heavily dominant in those seas and so spread out in the world system on the ocean. And that is where the hemisphere becomes important. That's where the ports become important. That's where the shipping routes and trade routes become important. That's where the Caribbean islands living in water become important. I think she's going to spread out in that way, and that is going to increase the tensions. So I don't think the Taiwan issue is limited to one China policy. And I don't think that it is limited to the US and China. I think it really has global implications for the kind of reconfiguration that people are striving for in the world, and in which China is contradictory in its intentions to the United States and possibly Europe in alliance with each other.
Okay, thank you very much, Bo. And I'm going to raise this question, an economic one for Roger, but anybody could jump in if they wish afterwards. How is the rise in the Chinese currency, the yuan, as a global reserve currency likely to impact China? Let me just add for the listeners, there are many countries of the world who have already moved in the direction of replacing the US dollar with the yuan as a reserve currency, and they're settling debts in the Chinese currency. And in addition to that, most of the CARICOM, all of the CARICOM, their reserves are kept in US dollars. So what is the likely impact on CARICOM, Roger? Roger?
Yeah.
Are you hearing me?
You're hearing you
Yes.
now?
Okay, yes, sorry. As the Chinese yuan becomes more and more popular, it would put increasing pressure on some CARICOM countries to change their store of reserves, not all, some of their reserves into yuan. It would, in order to facilitate greater trading transactions with China. In fact, it is not impossible, as trade ties deepen with China, that China could insist on being paid in a certain way. And if they do insist in that direction, that in turn could put more pressure on Caribbean authorities to make certain changes in the way we store our reserves. Having said that, though, whilst I know that trend and I don't see it as a major threat to the US dollar being the preferred currency for reserves probably in the next 15 to 25 years. Beyond that, it can likely change. And I mean, India is also becoming a force in the world as we move along. I think that the more important issue for Caribbean economies is not necessarily in what currency they trade, but certainly if their capacity to trade, the growth of the Caribbean region has slowed so much in the last 15 years, apart from Guyana, really. I mean, if you take Trinidad and Tobago, our average economic growth since 2016 has been minus 2.23%. And the other Caribbean countries are not doing that well. So I would say, yes, it would put some pressure on the choice of and in the way we store our reserves. But I think the Caribbean has much greater problems. And in particular, when I look at some of the data that Mark presented, I think the drive is ready to get economic growth. And that's where China comes in as a big opportunity. It comes in as a big opportunity in terms of a huge market, both in terms of population and GDP that could buy more of our export products. If you look at the limited amount of commodities we currently export to China, it means that the significant amount of zeros we have in terms of export sectors there gives us great room in terms of opportunity to export more items to China. But we have to do homework. We have to get the Ministry of Trade in the region in the various countries to do the right type of trade data analysis. We have to get CARICOM to do more detailed technical analysis. In particular, for example, what are the commodities that we are strong at, that China is buying more of, that we could therefore get as low-hanging fruits? And I don't think I have seen that analysis anywhere. In fact, and I will use this as a basis to throw out, once Professor Watson allows, a question to Mark Wenner. Mark, I know you have had experience at the IDB, and I know you cannot answer for the IDB now, but I'm going to ask you, what is the role of the multilateral institutions, in your opinion, now that you had that experience, in facilitating greater potential trade or greater potential trade ties between CARICOM and China as we move forward? So I hope I answered my question, and I also raised a question of my own.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think I would probably take it on two ways. For the audience that may not know, I basically worked 20 odd years for the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank. And then retired, and now I'm here back in my homeland, the Virgin Islands, teaching. What is the role of the multilateral? So first of all, the multilateral development agencies, they are searching for new mission. They are adrift. World Bank, IMF, Inter-American Development Bank. So that is a real reality. As you and Dr. Tawari mentioned, they just don't have the capital anymore. And China is outlapping them in lending to every region of the world. So that's an issue. So there's a kind of a crisis of how does these multilateral development institutions raise more capital and leverage it for development? That's one big problem. In terms of the Caribbean, where I see the IDB doing is that the IDB seems to be focusing much more on climate change adaptation, innovation along these lines, kind of a more forward-looking, a policy in that line. And they're kind of abandoning the old bread and butter, which used to be infrastructure financing, trade development, investments in the social sectors. They're kind of like leaving that aside. I think if an argument definitely can be made for the Caribbean region to basically try to revitalize its export sector, to try to gain more value added, more sophistication in its content, identify niche markets. That argument, I think, is very valid and can easily be made. The question is, like, who would have the wherewithal to help in this regard? I think the most natural one would be UNCTAD, the United Nations. trade and development, but they have very, very limited budget. They don't have much gravitas in this regard. I think it's a good idea, but the problem is that these institutions, they're searching. They're searching and they don't really have a clear mission anymore.
All right, I want to take off from a point that you have raised, Mark, and some of the questions, a lot of the questions have concerned exports to China. You also
Yes.
talked about imports, but I am much more interested in exports, and you just raised that as well. And I would like to know, and the audience really would like to know, I'm trying to summarize or trying to incorporate all the questions into one. What kinds of products have been able to penetrate the Chinese market? Because it's a massive market. And how can we, and someone raised the question of tourism. Now, I myself have had some, I know the Chinese, you see Chinese tourists everywhere in Europe. I have a feeling that they are not attracted to the Caribbean because I don't think they like the sun too much. Right? That's the general thing that I have. So that may be a non-starter. But what other kinds of products, goods, and services that we could sell to China, and what is already penetrating the Chinese market? I think I have captured about 4 questions in one there. About what penetration of the Chinese export market or in the Chinese import market, if you wish, with exports from the Caribbean. What is it? What's its size? Roger, you could start, and I suspect Mark, you seem eager to kick off, so go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have detailed product level type information. So I wouldn't be able to speak on that. So probably Roger could address that. But I would say in broad brush, what you see in the big aggregates is this resources that are going in to China. So the bauxite, the timber, etc., oil, gas. So I think in those resource or commodity based, there's a lot of room to add value to them. I would even say, especially in the agro processing area. So, for example, one of the most interesting things I was reading about is that China used to be a tea country, and now it's converted into a coffee country. Where's Jamaican coffee in the mix? As a high-end, niche market, they probably don't have the volume to supply all of China, but these are opportunities for things because the food taste of China is changing. And so there's a lot of stuff we can do and high-value agricultural products, processed products, niche products that I think we could focus on to gain. In terms of the Chinese tourism, which would be considered exports for the region, I think there's considerable work needs to be done, but you need to have it targeted. It's true that Chinese, for example, they get their tropical sun, sand, and beach fix in the South Pacific. They go to Guam. They go to the Northern Marianas. They go to Southeast Asia. They go to Thailand. They go to Vietnam. So we may not be able to attract the middle to low end sun and sand beach market because it's just so costly and so long to get here. But we could entice the cultural Chinese tourists. So, for example, again, reading, believe it or not, the lowly steel band of Trinidad is a very hot thing in China. It is cool to learn steel band in China. So this is an opportunity to bring people to the region to learn to play steel band, produce steel bands for their market, electronic steel bands, upscale. So those are kind of little markets that we could certainly pursue at, in that regard. So I leave it at that, and maybe Roger can add some more details because you probably have much more, the HITS type flows to see what is the Caribbean producing that could possibly penetrate into the Chinese market. But I think the Chinese market is rife for more high value imports from the Caribbean. We will never be a big volume producer, so we have to aim at quality and niche markets, unusual things, and make our money in high margin.
Roger?
Right. So I think in a circular way, Mark tried to answer the question that was posed to me with, and I would just put some more terminology to it. So there is a methodology that we can explore to look at where the low-hanging fruits are. And it's something that Caribbean countries do very poorly, even CARICOM. You could look at the International Trade Center and calculate export potential. That's where you could get the type of commodities that China is buying, that you are producing and have comparative advantage in, and you could get an idea of the export potential gap. And you could get this data up to the HS 6-digit level, so you could see how much more methanol you could sell, how much more urea, how much more timber, and products of that nature. Where I think we have fallen short, Mark, and I was hoping that you could have elaborated a little more on this, is that I think somewhere in the region, I know Botiwari tried to set up something like this while he was here at the university. We need a think tank entity that answers or looks at these questions. The China and India in particular, and if I may join them as the literature doesn't call them Chindia, represent tremendous opportunities in the next 75 years.
Yeah.
And in that next 75 years, we should not adopt a laissez-faire approach towards embracing these type of countries. We should do calculated research and see where the benefits lie. So what is the growth trajectory, for example, for China for the next 15 years? What are the type of products that growth trajectory, when superimposed on their imports, would create a different demand for? And what are the commodities that we have export productive capabilities within the Caribbean that align with that 15-year trajectory of demand? These things can be done, and we need to get it done in a dedicated way. I note that in many universities and in many countries I remember in 1995, when I went to Cambridge, there was a Chinese Institute of Study. I mean, that is so long ago. And this is 2024 going on 2025. I think we need something like that in the Caribbean, preferably lodged at CARICOM, that could answer those very same type of questions that Professor Watson raised. But there are methodologies. It could be done. We just need to go out there and do it.
Bo, you want to add anything to that?
Look, I think export is the critical. I mean, a lot of good things were said by both Mark and Roger there. Exports are the critical things. I mean, if we don't do that, we are going to be in a mess, not 75 years from now, but maybe 20 years from now. The second thing is that 75 years is a good target year to keep in mind when you're dealing with a market, China and India, of nearly 2.5, 2.6, maybe nearly 3 billion people. Now, I raised the question of size between China and CARICOM and China and the Caribbean. You're dealing with a big country. Same with India, you're dealing with a small country. And Mark made the point that, you know, we can't produce much. We really need good quality, niche interventions in order to do well. I will just mention two things. One, let's say the belabored idea of pepper sauce. But the point is that a unique pepper sauce that is flavorsome can make a difference. You have 800 million people out of poverty in China. And to sell 1 million pepper sauce, bottles of pepper sauce, in any given time, whether it's a year or whatever, will be of tremendous value to any company producing here. But it means private sector intervention. It means somebody has to take the risk. It means the organization has to be done. The technology has to be employed to have the most efficient system. And you have to have the logistics right so you can get all your things in the destination point that you want to have it, and the distribution in China that then makes it possible. Now, that takes a little doing. And I mean, I don't have to tell you, if somebody could sell 1 million bottles of pepper sauce in China every year, they're in business, okay? So it seems to me that you have to start with a simple idea and do it so exceptionally well at every point in the value chain that you do not fail. So that is one thing. The second thing I would say is culture. I mean, Mark mentioned steel band, but we have a very diverse culture. You don't have to go with steel band alone, which is one thing, though unique. You could go with a variety. We have calypso, we have soca, we have chutney, we have tassa, we have all kinds of things. And selling a program to 100,000 people in China is nothing to get 100,000 people to come up. And that would be a larger audience than any audience you can command in the Western Hemisphere. But you've got to link a tourism strategy to that. So people will come here. They will see the culture in action. They will see that we not only have steel bands, but we have pan jazz, that we have a diversity of culture. We have all kinds of things. And they have the good experience, and you go back there, and that immediately becomes your market. And we should really be working with the tourism market from China and the culture market from Trinidad and Tobago for exports. And I feel that that is something that we can do sustainably because China is that large. And so I just mentioned those things. I think it's something that we have to do. And I just don't know if we have the wherewithal, the gumption, the dedicatedness, you know, the business skill, the strategy, the partnership making to get it done. Because if you do it, you have to just not create the opportunity. You have to sustain it and build it. And, you know, something like that we could build, and it could be sustainable over 75 years or more.
Okay, I'm just going to make a comment. There's the tourism aspect of the export sector has come up. And I think it's an excellent idea, but I didn't know that the Chinese did the sun and sea and sand there. And I think if that is a possibility, you're looking, and I'm talking about the region as a whole here. There's a large Chinese population in countries like Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and I don't know to what extent they are interested in the diaspora, or the diaspora could interest them. And to that extent, I don't know if that can be used as a Trojan horse to get the Chinese to come here. It is a far distance to travel, but when I'm in Europe, I see these massive amounts of Chinese visiting places all over. You see them walking the streets. They seem to have a preference for white Europe. I've seen them even in Moscow and St. Petersburg and so on. And they fill up the hotels, and you could imagine imagine the same 100,000 is used as a figure. That fills up a lot of the hotels on the north coast of Jamaica very, very quickly. Anyway, that's another matter, and you could respond to it while you respond to this one. The question of Trinidad and Tobago and other countries of the Caribbean becoming members of BRICS. You know what that is going on now. There's this big move now to have this alternative to US hegemony, and people are joining it, and they are going to be using a currency that is not the US dollar as well. What are the economic and political implications of countries of the Caribbean becoming members of BRICS? Mark, you want to go with that first? Because
Yeah, I haven't really formed thoughts about that. But I would be hesitant to try to go with another new currency. I think, where where we really need to be thinking about is not necessarily a new currency, but that's going to compete. What I really think we need, the focus has to be much more
forget
on
the new currency for the while. Just becoming a member of BRICS. I mean, there will be currency implications. I am aware of that.
yeah.
But there are many, many other implications of becoming a member of that grouping. All right. And it's becoming bigger and bigger. And there are African countries that are joining. I mean, South Africa is already a part. The S in BRICS is South Africa. And you have other people coming more and more interested. So I wonder to what extent, as a pole to not just oppose, but to stand as an alternative to a relationship with the United States of America, because these are big markets you're talking about. Brazil, India, China. If we could get, I mean, a little bit of those markets will, I think Bo pointed this out, will satisfy a lot of us in the Caribbean. You don't need to be a major a player as how China is in the rest of the world. You just need a nice little share of these markets, both in India, and we have the possibilities. I mean, we are linked to them in a diasporic way. And I think we should use that possibility. I don't think we should ignore that possibility. So.
No, I think you can see BRICS as the new non-alignment movement. Yeah, and most definitely, I think there's a lot more pros to joining such a grouping. But I have to tell you the truth, I have not really thought deeply about it, but I see on the surface, yes, I think that any type of alliance that small island states can make with countries that are larger markets, it behooves them. But I think the focus nonetheless is not so much joining another group, but turning inward on the fundamentals. The Caribbean people are good at diagnosing stuff. We're very poor at acting. We're very poor at doing the governance reforms, the institutional reforms, the competitiveness improvements that need to be done, and that will make the difference. So, for example, in the 1980s, there was the Caribbean Basin Initiative, free duty entry into the United States. We did not take advantage of it because of our lack of competitiveness, our cost structure in that regard. Many of the Caribbean islands, for example, were involved in Petrocaribe, didn't make good use of the money. And so I think the focus has to be more on a revolution in good governance, in visionary leadership, in good, solid institutions, and get away from this corrupt, crony capitalism that we have that's holding us back. We have stoloric systems of governance that has really prevented us from making the big, innovative changes that we need. So joining a foreign organization or a alliance is not going to get us there. The focus really we need better quality leaderships. We need better institutional reforms in each of the Caribbean states. Otherwise, is nothing but talk. Here in the Virgin Islands, we have $8 billion of government free grant assistance from the U.S. government for disaster recovery. We can't spend it. The money going back.
Yeah. Roger, you want to say?
Would it help us to join CARICOM? No. We can't do the basics. We can't collect trash. We can't educate students. We can't, manage projects.
Well, what I would say is that we have enough technical capacity in the region to understand that the BRICS, let us ignore BRICS. Let us focus solely on China. that China and India are not going to go away. China and India are not going to, because of the stage they are at in the cycle of economic activity, they are not going to disappear. And therefore, it makes really good sense. The timing is probably a little late for China, but even so, it's better now than ever. It makes really good sense for us to invest some resources into better understanding the medium-term outlook of those economies and what it means for our trade dynamics, what it means for our, and by trade I include tourism, what it means for us. That's one of the things we have been very terrible at in the past and continue to be terrible at, this art of doing the
Planning.
underlying homework and planning ahead. So
I agree fully with you. I mean, you know, there was this reveal competitiveness studies that used to be done back in the 90s, the 80s, 90s. I have not seen one in the Caribbean done in over a decade.
And Mark, apart from that piece of work you did on, I think yours was a type of overview. I'm not sure if it was on CARICOM or Guyana, but it was more overview and to get the ball rolling, which was very welcome. Dr. Tiwari mentioned a piece, I think, by Anita from International Relations. There was a piece in 2015 by Richard Bernal, again, elementary, just covering the basic macroeconomics. It really took us by surprise when we looked at the material that neither the IMF, the World Bank, the IDB, CARICOM, CDB, CEDA did any substantive understanding of the growth of China, and I'm open to correction if someone knows something that I don't know, on the CARICOM sphere and how we could lock into that growth scenario. So even if BRICS goes forward or doesn't, I mean, I can't see India and China working together in this manner and form for an extensive period of time, but I could be wrong. But even on their own, China and India are in the next 75 years probably going to be number 1 and 2 largest economy in the world, and we should have a plan. We should, you know, we have a poor way of embracing Chinese and to a lesser extent Indian tourists in the region. We have a perception of tourism and of a tourist that I think we would need to change. And we have some groundwork to do and some homework to do. And I think now is the ideal time to get our systems going to capitalize on that. I certainly hope, Mark, at some point in time, the university you are at and our university could do some collaborative, even at a minimum, seminars on that and share it with the region. But definitely, I think now the timing is perfect now to move this ball.
No, I agree. I agree. We need to be more forward-looking and be strategic and instead of always reactive and always begging. You know, we have to bake our own bread.
Yeah, Bo, what I'm getting, and you could add in any way you wish, is that they're not necessarily becoming members of the BRICS, which is a political move in addition to an economic one, but that we must not ignore the realities of these markets, which is in a way the discussion we're having generally anyway.
Well, the first thing I would say is that, you know, BRICS is largely political. It's an attempt to subdue the dominance of the West, so to speak, and the control of the dollar and the impact of Western-made decisions as impositions on the rest of the world, which are largely developing countries. So from my point of view, it's political, and it does not really take into account the work that you have to do as a country on your own behalf in order to be something in the world. And the second thing is that if you look at our history, you will find out that we really have not taken advantage of the opportunities we have. We have an existing CBI arrangement with the United States now. and we do not capitalize on it. The Canadians expanded Caribbean without us even advocating for it by 10 years to give us an opportunity. And we have diasporas in both countries. The United States, we have several diasporas. In Canada, we have a major one in Toronto, but we have elsewhere. And we have arrangements with Europe that, in fact, create preferential conditions for certain things. And we are not capitalizing on that. And the point is that we have a twin problem. We have a triple problem, if I could use the Trinidad and Tobago case to extrapolate and say for the entire Caribbean. I think we have a leadership problem and a vision problem, first of all, where we cannot see ourselves other than being small states. But Singapore is a small state. That island in the Indian Ocean, Mauritius, is a small state. And they are doing pretty well. Estonia is a small state. So you need leadership and vision to see yourself as a productive, contributing, competitive country in the world, so that you can push that vision and filter it down through your school system, the way that you behave, your attitudes, everything, the NGOs, the voluntary organizations, so people eat it up and simply imbibe it. And it becomes part of the cultural matrix of their society. The second thing, you need governance requirements in order to have a country that facilitates and supports business. You cannot not want business and be hostile to profits and to be worried about who is growing too big, and you are not addressing the issue of development. And you cannot not understand that a country does not compete. It is businesses in a country that compete with each other for market share and win foreign exchange that helps to develop the country. And you have to understand those basic things. And you then have to create the policies and the support infrastructure to make businesses thrive and grow, to have startups, to encourage entrepreneurship, to push exports, to integrate with the rest of the Caribbean, do things together, etc. And the third thing is that you cannot be lazy and prosper. You have to have an attitude of productivity and production and competitiveness and of getting ahead, of having ambition, going to school, learning more, understanding where the new opportunities are, seizing them, being creative, critically thinking about your environment and thinking, well, what more do we need? What else do we need? And, Arthur Lewis said it, everything begins with the market. You have to start from the market backwards. What do they want? What do I have to sell? What can I create that I can make them want? Everything begins with the market. And I really feel that the Caribbean is becoming duncier and duncier, not because we are dunce people. We are becoming duncier and duncier because we have a limited view of the world. We have a limited view of ourselves and what we could do. We do not understand that we can do anything we want if we put our mind to it and we harness the resources to do it. And you've got to create the kind of infrastructural support system to make that possible if you are a government, because that's why people elect you. And finally, you've got to have ambition and drive and entrepreneurial spirit in your society among your citizens so that they can make things, do things, make it happen. And if you nullify all of those things that I've mentioned, and put them in second place or third place or fourth place, and something else is first place that contributes nothing to these other things, then you're bound to be headed for failure.
All right, Bo, I think, I mean, yes, I hear you, and I don't want this discussion to continue between us, but what you are raising there is the internal issues we have with dealing with anybody,
That's right.
and not just China. And if we have to take advantage of all these markets, in particular, something like the Chinese market, something as we have to have a different approach to everything. And you mentioned Singapore, which is a good case in point, which has left us behind. And yes, indeed. I want to add, this may be the last round before I ask people to wrap up. It depends on how it goes. Otherwise, I may ask another one. I think it was Mark who mentioned, it could have been Bo, about the Chinese owning a lot of the infrastructure in the region as we speak, the port in Kingston and so on. I didn't know all of this and so on. To what extent is this thing that people refer to as debt diplomacy going to be a real problem in the Caribbean? Now, I buy what Roger said earlier. I think he mentioned that this is not something that you go into with your eyes closed or anything like that. Some people jump at an opportunity and they lose it. But it sometimes trying to get an easy solution may end up being bad for you. And I know that, and this is anecdotal in a way, there seems to be some rising anti-Chinese sentiment in some of these countries, in particular Jamaica, where a lot of the things that were mentioned, I can't remember if it was by Bo or by Mark, or some of the penetration of the Chinese in these countries, that it was raising a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. To what extent these things are going to be problematic for us?
Yeah, if I may, yeah, so far we've kind of talked about the positive sides of the Chinese engagement, but there are some troubling undertones and negative elements that need more study and fleshing out and needs being addressed. So I have physically and personally seen in two countries. In Guyana, I was stationed there for 4.5 years, and in Jamaica through frequent visits in my previous job, and interaction even with big Chinese companies trying to do projects. So and even the Chinese Import-Export Bank. So I think there are troubling things the way how the Chinese do business, that you have to be very wary, and you have to know how to negotiate well, and you have to know what is your interest and how to protect your interests. Because China is not a savior. China is just a new style imperialist. So you have to understand that. They are focusing on developing an economic empire around the globe that benefits them and they're in control of. So that is their end goal. Their end goal is to surpass the United States, is to be a big power. So that is their goal. So you have to understand that. They don't necessarily love you. The way the Chinese operate is that they do not put any conditionality on anything. So no policy conditionality. If you deal with the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, in their loan documents, you have to tell them how many women you're going to benefit, how many indigenous people you're going to benefit. You have all these equity and environmental conditions they put on you, and it's stringent, lots of bureaucracy. They don't care what you do with the money. They don't care if you're corrupt. They don't care if you're a leftist. You don't care if you're a rightist. They don't care if you're a dictator, if you're a good person or a bad person. They do business with you. And that is their approach. So this lack of conditionality, the lack of environmental safeguards and standards may seem very attractive because it lower transactions costs for, say, Caribbean states. But it also, the lack of transparency is also a problem. So basically, if you have a corrupt politician and you want to build something, and they say, well, how much would you want, Mr. Minister? We'll just tack it on to the bottom line and we'll add it into the loan. No problem. We call it a facilitation fee. And that's how they operate. So their lack of transparency and they're willing to engage with people with no standards leads to fostering corruption. And I think so far in the Caribbean, we've been very lucky to have no Chinese white elephants. But if you go to Africa and if you go to Southeast Asia, there are Chinese white elephants. And so that is the big thing you kind of have to realize. So we talked a little about the Sri Lankan port, Hamarato, that was taken over for 99 years. But now we have a similar problem that's developing with the Kenyan railroad line. The Chinese built a rail line from Mombasa all the way into Nairobi, Kenya, and their ultimate goal was to carry it all the way to Uganda and Rwanda. And on paper, strategically, it makes perfect sense. You basically connect Central Africa, these landlocked countries, on a modern railroad out to a main port, and they'll be able to export to the world. The problem is no economic feasibility was done, and there's not enough traffic on the line. So the railroad is not doing very well. So we have to kind of avoid those kind of projects in the Caribbean. Otherwise, we'll end up in these debt traps. And luckily, so far, it has not happened. But it could easily happen. You know, in that case, I was, for example, working on the Amalia Falls project in Guyana. That is a white elephant waiting to happen. And so if you don't have standards and know what you want and are serious and do good cost benefit, you get into trouble. The second thing I would say is that China has a lot of internal problems of itself. And so, you know, the trajectory for China may not be smooth. They have a huge real estate problem. They have serious environmental problems. And they have tensions between the elites that wants a military power and other parts of the elite that say, let's just be an economic power and let's not challenge the United States to have the largest navy in the world and to take over Taiwan. So they have internal issues of themselves that are going to play out, and how they're dealt with will affect basically the furtherance of the Belt Road Initiative. So the Belt Road Initiative, for example, is seen by many within China as being a very expensive foreign boondoggle. And they say, why spend all this money on others when we got so many problems internal to China? So we need to be cognizant of the full picture that's going on. So I leave it there and let some other people contribute.
All right, we'll have to go quickly. If anybody wants to contribute to that, because we want to start asking people to make their closing statements. Shall we move to the closing statements then? So I don't know, I'll go from the last shall be first. So Bo, you want to start with your closing statements?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I can close. Well,
You
first
can
of all,
add to that discussion to it that we just had.
I would like to thank Roger and the TDU, Rebecca, for organizing the session. It was very well done. And the contributions were fantastic. And your role as chair, Professor Watson, I mean, with your knowledge and with your own interest in the subject, I think really helped the discussion a little bit. I would like to say that China is an opportunity for us. It can also be a heavy burden to carry because we are not alone in the world. But whatever burden we have to carry, it'll be a shared burden. But the opportunity that we make will be our opportunity. And how it is shared depends on how we make that opportunity. And we have to make our opportunities. Nobody will come and give you an opportunity. It just doesn't happen. I saw a thing the other day where the guy was saying that the cow doesn't give milk. You have to get up in the morning at 4 o'clock. You have to make your way through the mess. You have to sit down next to it. You have to pull the others, and you have to get your bucket of milk. So the cow doesn't give milk. You have to do what is required to get the milk. And I think that that is where the Caribbean has reached. We are middle-income countries. We are facing a receding future. The world is going ahead. Technology is leaping forward. AI is going to divide the world in ways that we cannot now anticipate. And it's going to create problems that we have not yet begun to conceptualize or conceive. And we still have to survive. We have people to feed and people to work and people to engage and happiness to pursue. And we've got to understand that when you are a country, you have to engage in the long term. You have to engage in the long run. You have to think of generations. And the Caribbean and Latin America have an opportunity to come together now collaboratively. We have big powers in this hemisphere that we need to engage and do well with. And China is a big power in the world, competing to be the largest power. They are almost there already. And we have to engage China and make our bed with them in a constructive way of value to us. And I would say that we better be strategic. We better be nationalistic, regionalistic, hemispheric. And we better understand that God helps him who helps himself. And therefore, we've got to have a strategy and a plan for getting ahead over many generations. And I don't think we can wait anymore. The time is over. Either we do it now or we will never do it.
Okay, thank you very much, Bo. Roger, your closing remarks?
Yes, so I would strongly agree with what Dr. Tiwari said in closing, in that we have a situation in the region here where, you know, we are in such a state of what I will call economic stagnation. And if I were to narrow the conversation down to Trinidad and Tobago, I would say that we definitely need the injection of Chinese capital where it is possible, because our good performance, if you look at the data from 2016 to 2023, was the 7th worst in the world according to the IMF data. I hope I remember the exact number correctly. But if it's not 7th, it's 8 or 9 or somewhere in that zone. This injection of capital, especially if it helps to come with export market, would help open up economic opportunities for Trinidad and Tobago at a time when our natural gas production is poised to go even further downwards. I think it's not a time to engage in small talk and old talk. I think it's a time to go deep into these conversations and actually get more of the Phoenix Park type E-Tech Park activity going. And if it comes with the Louisiana market that Sir Arthur Lewis mentioned, I think this could only work beneficial for Trinidad and Tobago, and if other Caribbean countries, of course, do the same for the region. Notwithstanding that, I'm not going to ignore the point that Mark made, and that is well known about the debt shot possibilities. And so CARICOM negotiators must keep that in mind. We cannot overreach as regards to seeking investment opportunities, especially, and we must do our homework and our groundwork for this to work in our favor. But I think it's an opportunity we cannot let roll past easily. And I hope that the region's policymakers put in the necessary think tank institution so we can get some of the underlying analytical work to facilitate this arrangement. Thanks.
Mark, well, let's try and keep it in the time then. So
yes, I would basically echo what the other two speakers have said. Yes, China does represent an opportunity. China is a rising power. They have to be engaged with. I would say that the main thing is that we have to be smart. We in the Caribbean, we have to have good leadership. We have to pay attention to details. We have to prepare ourselves to really engage and negotiate well. And we have to focus on really fundamental structural reforms that would allow us to increase growth possibilities as well as trade competitiveness. And I do second and third what Roger is saying is that we do need to have some sort of analytical studies and reveal competitive advantage, market opportunities for exports for Caribbean goods and services into the market, and even new strategies of how to attract maybe cultural and Chinese tourists interested in ethnographic cultural activities as opposed to the sand, sun, and beach. So there's a lot of work to be done. I would say much of it is on our shoulders, our leadership shoulders, our people, and in particular, our business sector. So I end with that. And again, thank you for the invitation. It was a true pleasure. I learned a lot, and I hope that the audience gained something fruitful as well. So again, thanks you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mark. Now, let me say the final word because I have been asked to do that. I want to thank, first of all, the panelists and for excellent presentations and for excellent interventions. I myself learned a lot. I still have to go and double check some of the things I heard just to make sure that I am just not going to take in all of it and take it as truth. And I do think that the topic is an extremely important one. We are looking at markets that are beyond our traditional markets. Some of us have already begun penetrating these markets. We have some natural advantages with the Chinese and the Indian markets in particular, because we share an ancestry. My own great-grandfather came from China. He was a Hakka Chinese. That's why I'm so tall and handsome. You know, he was a tall, handsome China man. Yes, and many of us do have that shared heritage. I want to thank the audience and the many questions. I tried my best to summarize a lot of, because many were similar. So I don't want you to be discouraged the next time. We have to send in your things. I couldn't name everybody who sent them in, but they were all very interesting. And we are very grateful for them, because we kept the panelists on their toes and had them responding. Let me wish you, in Trinidad and Tobago, this is the longest weekend of the year, and that's barring Carnival, because Carnival is technically not a holiday in Trinidad and Tobago. But this is because we have Friday as a holiday and Monday as a holiday. So it's a very long weekend, and many people go to the beach at this time. So we all have a good time. I want to wish all of you a happy and joyous Easter, a safe one if you're going to the beach, because you have to be very careful. Don't drink too much if you're going into the water. The water can be quite risky, and that and rum doesn't mix very well at times. Do have a splendid weekend, and thanks again for everybody. I hope I didn't miss out anybody, the audience, the UE communications team, all of you for making this an excellent show. I enjoyed it very much. I didn't fall asleep. That's always a good sign, because it was a good one. Thank you. Bon appetit, and do have a good weekend. Take care. I am leaving.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.